Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to present what Descartes does in the second meditation. Let us recall briefly what Descartes did in the first meditation. The aim overall that he has is to establish a firm foundation for the sciences, where firm means a certain foundation, that it cannot be rationally doubted, and that will ensure that people agree about scientific results. To establish certainty, he needs to look at various possible sources of knowledge and find which source is something that can be relied upon in all cases with 100% certainty. And so what Descartes does is go through different ones, namely the senses, as well as reasoning as is done in mathematics. But he raises doubts for these two possible sources of knowledge. The senses sometimes deceive, and likewise we cannot distinguish between dreaming and reliable sense perception. With regard to mathematical knowledge, Descartes posits the possibility that there's an evil genius that deceives him. And so if you put yourself in Descartes' shoes, you want to think, can you rule out the possibility that there's this evil genius that's deceiving you every time you perform a mathematical calculation? And if you cannot rule that out with 100% certainty, then what the evil genius could deceive you about is not known with 100% certainty. So the task now is to find something that cannot be rationally doubted. So basically what Descartes does is consider how far can doubt be taken. So in the second meditation, the meditator supposes that they have denied the senses, the body, things like that, any possible existence. And the question is, can the meditator deny something further, just his own or her own existence? So the meditator asks, is it then the case that I too do not exist? Just like I can suppose that my body doesn't exist, just as I can suppose that the external world doesn't exist, can one also suppose that there's some possibility that oneself doesn't exist? And so what the meditator says is, no, that doesn't really make sense. That's kind of an unintelligible doubt. So the meditator says, but doubtless I did exist, if I persuaded myself of something. The point there is, if I persuade myself that the senses are deceptive, I am persuaded. I have to exist. It's a presupposition of my doubting that I exist. Descartes applies the same reasoning to the evil genius hypothesis. So the meditator supposes there's some deceiver or other who is powerful and supremely sly and is always deliberately deceiving them. Then the meditator makes the same point that we just saw. The meditator says, there is no doubt that I exist if he is deceiving me. If this evil genius is deceiving me, the evil genius has to be deceiving something, and that something is me. It's a presupposition of the act of doubting that one is doing the doubting, that oneself is doing the doubting. And this is true, as the meditator says, even if the evil genius does as much as they can to deceive them. Now, all this leads to the formulation of the conclusion. The meditator says, quote, thus, after everything has been most carefully weighed, it must finally be established that this pronouncement, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. Note the way that Descartes formulates this. He's not saying that it is necessarily true that I am, I exist. After all, I might not have existed, 50 years ago, or I won't always continue to exist. His point, rather, is that if he is thinking, if he is doubting, then it is necessarily true that someone is doing the thinking, that someone is doing the doubting. Notice the phrase that's used there that I put in bold, I am, I exist. Now that's what Descartes says in the Meditations. The more famous phrase is, I think, therefore I am. which in Latin is cogito ergo sum. That famous phrase comes from Descartes' earlier work, The Discourse on Method, and basically he is expressing the same thought here. And in both cases, in the Discourse on Method and the Meditations, it's important to note that this exercise, the cogito, is something that is done from a first-person perspective. So it's not as if Descartes is proving to us that he exists. Rather, he's proving to himself that he exists. And the exercise of doing a meditation, we're supposed to carry this out for ourselves, and doing this, each person can, for himself or herself, establish the conclusion that they exist, but they cannot further establish that anyone else exists. So, we have one piece of knowledge that is 100% certain, the knowledge of one's own existence. But Descartes now wants to try to build on this knowledge and see if there's anything else that we can know with certainty. What he considers next is the question, what am I? What is my nature? What kind of being am I? What is my essence? Descartes considers a few possible answers to the question. One is that he's a rational animal. But that's not really a good answer because that notion of animal entails having a body. And at this stage, Descartes doesn't know that he has a body. All that he's aware of is thinking and existing as a thinking thing. And so if we use that awareness that is embedded in the cogito, that I think, therefore I am, what we can conclude with 100% certainty, according to Descartes, is that we are a thinking thing and nothing but a thinking thing as he formulates it here. And what that means is having a mind, an intellect, understanding, or reasoning. Recall that the doubt that was initiated in the first meditation was the result of reasoning. It involved considering hypothetical scenarios and reasoning about why those would rule out knowledge being had with 100% certainty from things like the senses. So what we're aware of at this point is having a nature as being a rational thing, a thinking thing. And this involves a variety of actions, mental actions, such as doubting, affirming, denying, willing, and so on. Descartes will come back to this question of what is my nature later in the meditations. But I want to conclude by looking at a few objections to what we've seen. One quick note is that the meditation actually goes further. The second meditation has a few more conclusions that aren't so important for our purposes, so I excised them from the text that I gave you. But there are some objections that we ought to consider to the part that we read. The original publication was facilitated by Descartes' friend, Mersenne. And Mersenne just basically contacted a bunch of people, sent a bunch of different philosophers, scientists, Descartes' text, and asked them to criticize and to give their evaluation of what Descartes had written, and then Descartes would respond in print to those objections, and all of this would be published together. And all the objections are anonymous, but we know in some cases who these people were. We could figure it out from other evidence. And so I'm going to focus on 3 different objections. The first objection comes from Gassendi, who is a scientist, and he worried, as many philosophers later would, that this cogito ergo sum, might be an inference. So that word ergo means something like therefore. So if ergo means something like therefore, it seems to indicate that some sort of reasoning was used to establish one's existence. But notice why that might be problematic. The evil genius is someone that can trip us up in our reasoning, in our mathematical reasoning, for example. So if we know our own existence through an inference, then it seems like the evil genius could trick us. A related worry comes from Thomas Hobbes, who wonders whether we can know that our own mind is a substance. So what Descartes says in the second meditation is that I am nothing but a thinking thing. That word thing here, Descartes is using much more like this notion of substance. And that notion of substance in the Western philosophical tradition means a thing that is an ultimate reality. If we give an inventory of what exists and we want to limit ourselves to what ultimately exists and cannot be explained by other things, then we posit those things as being substances. They underlie, they stand under everything else. And so it seems like what Descartes is saying is that I am a thing and a fundamental reality, so to speak. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because Descartes says that he knows that he exists via the act of thinking or doubting. Now, there's clearly an awareness of the action of thinking, of the action of doubting. But the question here is whether we can posit something that carries out the thinking. Maybe the thinking doesn't require something to do it. Maybe there's just acts of thinking, acts of doubting, and so on, and that's all there is. So if we take what Thomas Hobbes says with what Gassendi says, we see a further reason to doubt what Descartes has done. If we establish that we are a thinking thing on the basis of an inference, well, then it seems like the evil genius might have tripped us up. Maybe there's just acts of thinking, acts of doubting, and we cannot infer that we really are a thing that thinks. The final worry comes from Mersenne, Descartes' friend, and it's quite similar to the previous ones. Descartes phrases it here that he is nothing but a thinking thing. Now, that seems much too strong. He says he is a thinking thing and only a thinking thing, and what that means is only a thinking thing or a soul and not a body. So he's saying my thinking doesn't depend on anything else. That's what it means to say that he's nothing but a thinking thing. But why think at this stage that one's thinking doesn't depend on anything else? Maybe thinking does require a body, a brain, or something of that sort. And so that conclusion doesn't seem to be all that warranted. Now, at this point, it's worth noting that Descartes has arguments later in the Meditations to support this very strong claim that he is nothing but a thinking thing. But it seems like he's not warranted at this stage to make such a claim. So that's how we should understand Mersenne's objection. Descartes, you shouldn't be saying this at this point. You haven't enough arguments or reasons for it. Finally, I want to conclude by considering how original Descartes' argument here really is, the argument of the cogito. Now, it's been pointed out by some scholars that this thought, this argument that the cogito expresses, seems to exist in a text that predates the Meditations. In fact, a text by Jean Salon, who was someone that Descartes actually knew. And so this argument is something that might be the source of what Descartes does. There are other earlier sources like St. Augustine, even something in Aristotle, but this seems to be actually really close. So what does Jean Salon say? He says, every person who has the use of judgment and reason can know that they are. So that expresses the fundamental thought of the cogito, the fundamental conclusion. But what's important now is to see how Salon argues for this conclusion. First, this knowledge is so infallible that if all the operations of the external senses were deceptive in themselves, notice deception from the senses, one of Descartes' types of doubt, or if one could not distinguish between them and the operations of disturbed imagination. So Descartes also considers in the first meditation the possibility that he's just mad, that he has this disturbed imagination. Or if one could not be fully convinced that one is awake or asleep, and that what is seen is true or is an illusion as in dreams. Descartes obviously considers that type of doubt. If you consider all these things, Salon says, it is impossible to be mistaken in that original judgment. It is impossible to be mistaken about one's own existence. So what Salon does is go through 3 of Descartes' 4 types of doubt and says that this knowledge of one's own existence is immune from doubt based on these three sources. So what it seems like is that Descartes just adds a fourth source of doubt, this evil genius doubt, and uses that and supplements it to what Solon says. So it seems like it turns out Descartes is not this really great original thinker, but I want to say that the next thing that we'll consider, his argument for God's existence, which is usually much more derided than the cogito, that's actually where he's a very original thinker. So we'll turn to that argument in the next lecture.